We're really honored, I think, to have the Bowens and a few other guests join us this evening to talk about Sand Creek. I'd like to introduce to you Chuck. Raise your hand, Chuck.
That's me.
Okay. Son Mike.
It's me.
There we go. And then our two guest speakers, we have Butch Kane. Raise your hand, Butch. And Joe.
He'll be here shortly.
Okay, I didn't think I saw Joe. So it's really exciting. I had run into Chuck at Becky's restaurant and had said, hey, would you be interested in doing a program for genealogy for us? Because at that time he was really big doing a lot of stuff with Sand Creek. And lo and behold, part of his research there had everything to do with genealogy. I thought, perfect. Let's bring him in. Let's find out what both he and Mike have to say about it. And so that's exactly what we did. So we're going to have a presentation by them. Afterwards, I know some of you have already gone and looked through the artifacts that they have back there, but you're welcome to go back, ask questions, just see what's back there. Butch has a bunch of things from Calvary that, as you'll hear, took place at Sand Creek. So we want to do that. And then the last thing is they also brought a bunch of books that they are selling. So at the end of the program, if you're interested in buying a book, and they'll even autograph it for you, you're more than welcome to do that.
Well, so first off, I'd just like to thank the Genealogy Society for hosting us tonight. It's really kind of an honor to be able to come and share about our research and how genealogy fits in with that. Just a little bit of a brief overview that we'll be talking about in our presentation tonight. We used a lot of Ancestry records. We actually used Ancestry.com for a lot of them. I know there are other sites that people use, but a lot of our stuff came from Ancestry. Some of the things we learned about a soldier that was at Sand Creek. He was actually connected to Colonel Shimington 4 years before the Sand Creek event. We'll talk a little bit about that connection. So we'll talk a little bit about a soldier at Sand Creek that was connected to Colonel Shimington 4 years before. And there's a connection with Sand Creek and the Cray family. Some of you may remember that Cray packing plant. Somebody actually asked us about that this evening. And so yes, there's a connection there between that family and Sand Creek. There's a man that claimed to be the grandson of the signer of the Declaration of Independence that did something quite remarkable before Sand Creek. And then we'll talk about also there's a connection with George Bent at Sand Creek and why he went. And so the first person we're going to talk about here is a man named Elbridge Gerry. And Elbridge Gerry claimed to be the grandson of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, also named Elbridge Gerry. And we find from Irving Halbert in August of 1864, and I've got an excerpt here I'm going to read here. According to the program agreed upon by Indians, 100 warriors were to go to the valley of the Platte, 240 to the head of Cherry Creek, and the remainder of the 800 to the valleys of the Fountain and Arkansas rivers. Upon reaching the appointed localities, these parties were to be divided into small bands, each one of which was to attack a farmhouse, kill its occupants, loot the property, and run off stock. Elbridge Gerry, from whom the information of this proposed raid was received, was the grandson of the signer of the Declaration of Independence, and although an educated man, had lived with the Indians for a good many years and married a Cheyenne woman. At this time, he was living with his Indian wife on a stock ranch in the valley of the Platte River, 60 to 70 miles below Denver. It was here that the information reached him through two Cheyenne chiefs who came to warn him of the impending danger. Gerry received the word about midnight and early the next morning started on horseback for Denver to notify Governor Evans, arriving there about 11 o'clock that night, having ridden the 60 or 70 miles without resting. And so that is an excerpt from our book about Elbridge Gerry that we get from Irving Halbert. And so, but one thing that's really interesting with this about Elbridge Gerry, he claimed to be the grandson of the signer, but as we were doing research for Ancestry records, we found some discrepancies, and his story didn't quite match up with the timeline of what we know to be the actual grandson of the signer. So we have a slide here. We have a photo. That's the actual guy that went by the name Elbridge Gerry. but we have doubts. We don't think he's quite actually the grandson. But what we do know from that account from Irving Halbert, if he had not notified Governor Evans of this impending danger, what we have learned through research, it was likely that the events at Sand Creek actually would have probably happened months before and not at Sand Creek. And we learned through testimony also about Sand Creek that the Cheyenne and Arapaho went to Sand Creek about the middle of November, just a few weeks before the event. So they weren't there very long. So it likely would have happened before Sand Creek. But one reason we don't believe this man was Elbridge Gerry is due to ancestry records. And so what we found here, we have a military record for Elbridge Gerry. If you can't read that there, you should be able to read it okay. We know, though, that the actual grandson was born July 6, 1818 in Maine, enlisted as a private in the 8th Maine Infantry on September 7, 1861, promoted to corporal in 1865. He died of an illness on November 17, 1865 in Virginia at the age of 47. Now, according to the timeline, it just doesn't match, because the guy in Colorado claiming he built Elbridge Gerry could also be fighting in the 8th Maine Infantry back east. So it just simply doesn't fit the timeline. But why was he using an alias? We don't know. And we likely won't ever know the answer to that. But the information we do have about the guy claiming to be Elbridge Gerry is actually from a headstone. And on the headstone, it is kind of hard to read, but he does show a date of birth and a date of death. But that's really all the information we have about that man claiming to be Elbridge Gerry. But we also have the Gerry family tree. And you can see there at the top, Elbridge Gerry, that at the top left would have been the signer of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he had a son named Elbridge Gerry, and then his son had a son named Elbridge Gerry. So it's possible he just took the name because it was commonly used in the family. And who was going to question it? So we don't know for sure. That it's hard to know anything for certain about that, but we find that very interesting. But through ancestry records, we're able to come to the conclusion that that guy was not probably the actual grandson of the signer. But it's very interesting what we can learn and what we can confirm using ancestry records. Another connection that we have with our Sand Creek research, connecting with genealogy, is going to be the Cray family. And some of you may remember that Cray packing plant on South 13th Street here in town. That was owned by Lawrence Cray, who was the grandson of George Cray. And this is interesting because George Cray had a ranch on Sand Creek. We're not exactly sure where it was. We had a ranch on Sand Creek, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment. But there were some old soldiers that went out and visited that ranch when they tried to go and pinpoint the spot of the Sand Creek event. And so he had a ranch on Sand Creek, and he had two sons that were out at Sand Creek on that ranch. Their names were Dick and Jack Cray, and we learned about this through genealogy research, that they were out there. And we will see in this story about the four old soldiers, about their interaction there. But one thing we've located out on the Sand Creek on Dad's ranch is that he's located what appears to be a homesteader's dugout. Now, it's probably likely not where George Cray had his ranch, but it couldn't have been too far away from there, because we know it was somewhere on Sand Creek, so it had to be somewhere within a few mile radius of that. So it's unclear where he homesteaded, but in 1908, four old soldiers decided to hold a reunion and go and try to mark the spot. Those old soldiers were Morris Coffin, Lant Williams, W.H. Dickens, and David Hardin. And so those soldiers made their way to Sand Creek, and then that leads me to our next excerpt here. They eventually reached the Cray Ranch. They were destined to become better acquainted. The two Cray boys and their cowpunchers rode up. Dick Cray was the prankster. Paul's introductions were simple. Here's one of them soldiers that knocked heck out of the engines that time. Oh yes, and a reporter, he said. The tow-headed cowpuncher slipped into the inner room and began fiddling with something on the other side of the partition. There was a grinding and whirring noise, and then the tinkle of a piano on the phonograph. It was then drowned out by a low, off-key voice singing Old Cheyenne. Then the cowpuncher appeared in the doorway with a broad grin on his face, and the other cowboy, his spurs clattering bravely on the loose boards, danced to the music of the chorus, "Cheyenne, Cheyenne, hop on my pony. There's room here for 2 deer, but after the ceremony, we'll both ride back home, dear as one, on my pony from old Cheyenne." "Did Mr. Cray know where the battle was fought?" Coffin said. "Indeed, yes, most certainly. Right down there on the flat, about half a mile from here. Found a lot of arrowheads there once, and there's bones up on the bluff, other side of the creek. Human bones." "Yes, this is the place," Dick Cray said. "The ground doesn't look right. It must be further down the creek." Dickens took a long walk over the hills, the creek bed, climbed the sand bluffs, and returned silent and satisfied. Lance shook his head, and Hardman was silent. After a quick lunch, the teams were hitched, and they drove on down the creek. Clouds piled up to the south, the rolling landscape disappeared in a mist of rain, and they drifted through sheets of pouring water. The veterans, secure in slickers, stood up to scan the unfamiliar landmarks. At last, Lance thought he recognized something, but Coffin was unbending. "Ain't this the place where we laid our overcoats before we charged?" Lance said. "It's similar. I'll not deny that it's similar, but it ain't the same. We never fought over this ground," Coffin said. And so after they had got together to hold their reunion and try to mark the spot, all 4 of them had a different spot. They all left unsatisfied, and the spot was left unmarked. So in 1908, this site was essentially lost at that point. They did not know where it was. And so, they reached the Cray Ranch, and they asked questions and looked around, and the soldiers could not agree on a location. One of the things also we learned about through ancestry records that George's son Dick, that we had a picture of, it's still up there, he lived in Lamar, and in 1920, according to ancestry records, he lived at 205 West Olive Street in Lamar. Well, this is interesting, so we did some research, and what we could pinpoint is that 205 West Olive Street in Lamar is the parking lot for the Methodist Church. So it does not appear to be that house remains. George Cray also had a home in Lamar at 303 South 1st Street. We have a picture. There's the Cray. I'll stop here for just a moment so you can see the Cray family tree. You've got George Cray, and he's got his sons Jack, Dick, and then you also see Lawrence and George Cray, his children there. So that's a little bit of a glimpse at his family tree. And so George also, he had a home in Lamar. And we have a photo of that. And that's an old photo showing what it looked like years ago. And then Dad went and took a photo recently, about a week ago, and that's what it looks like today. It's 300 block of South 1st Street here in town, and George Cray lived there. So it's always really interesting to see the connections that we can learn using ancestry records, and then learning about them, what other connections there might be. And so another person that's very instrumental in our Sand Creek research was a man named Irving Halbert. He fought at Sand Creek, and he actually came out with his father in 1860. So we're going to take a look at another excerpt here. 14-year-old Irving and his father William, a Methodist minister, left their home in Quincy, Iowa, and headed for Denver, arriving 1 month later in June. He called Denver a small town made mostly of shacks. It left him disappointed. Shortly after arriving, his father met Reverend John M. Shivington, the presiding elder of the Methodist Church. Shivington appointed Reverend Halbert to take charge of a mission in Hamilton, in the South Park area. Irving and his father brought his mother and sister back from Quincy in 1861. In October, they moved to their permanent home in Colorado City. He soon witnessed Indian trouble. Early in 1863, the Indians began to attack and rob wagon trains, steal horses, and threaten exposed settlements, but nothing occurred to cause any great alarm in the immediate Pikes Peak region until the spring of 1864, Irving Halbert said. One of the events Halbert describes is the murder of the Hungate family on June 11, 1864. The father and mother had been shot down and mutilated with horrible brutality, and the children who had tried to escape had been pursued and killed, so that not one of the family was left alive. This news made the people of Colorado City and the settlers along the fountain and on the divide very uneasy. And of course, after that, they were constantly on the lookout, not knowing where the savages might next appear, according to Irving Halbert. And that was from Irving Halbert's account on what he witnessed in the early 1860s when they came to Colorado Territory. So that's interesting. So his father came out, he was 14 years old, and was connected to, the time was Reverend Shivington, who appointed William Halbert's ministry in Colorado. It's also noted that we learned through records and research that William Halbert's considered one of the first to preach in the southern part of Colorado. So we found that to be interesting, whether or not who was first or not. That's interesting though to read about that. And so we learned about Irving Halbert, and he was another thing we learned about Irving Halbert through ancestry records. He was one of the founding fathers of Colorado Springs. Very well-respected person, actually. He was in banking. He was in he had a lot of irons in the fire profession. He was well-respected in the Colorado Springs area. And again, only 18 at Sand Creek. And we have his military record here. You can see here that Halbert enlisted September 1st, 1864, and that he mustered out December 31st of the same year. And then he was Company G, 3rd Colorado Cavalry at Sand Creek. That's a look there at his military record. And this is interesting. So also through research and ancestry records, we learn about Irving Halbert is that he had a grandson named Irving Halbert. And so Dad and Mom got acquainted with him in 2007, and he was actually able to come out to the ranch. But also about the soldier Irving Halbert, he actually provided the single most important clue to my mom and dad to help discover the lost Sand Creek site. He provided the most important clue of all that helped them determine where to search. So his grandson of the same name, he came out in 2007, viewed artifacts, and there's actually a program held for him at the Cow Palace here in town. He was provided an honorary membership in the U.S. Cavalry Association while he was here. And so we have a photo here of Halbert. So he's in the center there, sitting down. The soldier there, he's an older man here in this photo, holding his grandson, Irving Halbert, and next to him is his son, William. So the little boy there, that's the grandson, Irving Halbert, that came out in 2007. And then we do have a photo of him as well. And there he is in 2007, viewing a sampling of some of the artifacts that Dad found out at Sand Creek. So he was actually able to come out and view some of those artifacts and then go out and look at the site and see where things happened there. We will have some time for questions here in just a minute. And so we learned there about Irving Halbert and his connection then with Sand Creek and his connection to Shivington 4 years before. So he was connected twice with Shivington while in Colorado Territory. So we have a look here, and we also have the Halbert family tree, I believe. So we have William Halbert. He was the reverend that was appointed by Shivington. He's there at the top. He had a son, Irving, that fought at Sand Creek. Irving had a son named William, and then William had a son named Irving. So it's interesting how these family names and how these things kind of pass down from generation and family names like that. So I find that stuff to be very interesting. So you see there a bit of a glimpse about William Halbert and his ancestry profile there. And also, we're going to talk a little bit about George Bent. And George Bent is connected to Sand Creek, as many of you know. He's part of the Bent family. His father, William Bent, built Bent's Old Fort, the trading fort. And William had 3 sons. He had George, Robert, and Charlie. And George Bent, who was at Sand Creek, was actually, he was born at Bent's Old Fort in 1843. And we do have their family tree here. So we see William Bent, he had son Charlie, Robert, and George. And Charlie and George were actually in the village with Black Kettle at Sand Creek. And then Robert Bent is connected to Sand Creek as well. We're going to talk about that in just a few moments. So there's a connection with all 3 of his sons and Sand Creek. And so what's interesting is after he built the fort, by 1853, William he needed a fresh start. So he decided to rebuild the forts. He blew the old one up, decided he needed a fresh start. A lot of tough things had happened while they had the old fort. He had family members die there, including his wife. So just needing a fresh start. It was also a difficult building to maintain. So he decided to build a new fort, and this time he decided to make it out of stone instead of adobe, and he built it higher where it wouldn't flood. So he decided to start new. And during his school years, George was sent to Missouri, and he was in Kansas City and also in St. Louis for his school years, for his education. Upon completion, though, he moved back to his father's ranch in Colorado Territory. But once the Civil War started, George Bent returned to Missouri, and he enlisted to fight in the Civil War. But since Missouri was a border state, George could decide, he had an option, he could choose to fight as either a Confederate or Union. So he actually decided to fight as a Confederate. And it's likely due to the Bent family in Missouri, they actually owned slaves. And they actually brought some of those with them when they came to build the fort in Colorado Territory. So he chose the life and chose to fight as a Confederate. And he fought in 4 Civil War battles. And one of those battles was the Battle of Corinth. And he was actually taken prisoner there. But he was able to get released and return back to Colorado Territory. But upon his return to Colorado Territory, he decided to choose the life of a Cheyenne dog soldier. So he decided that he chose the Cheyenne life, and he actually lived in Black Kettle's village at Sand Creek. And then again, like we saw, his brother Charlie was there too. And we have a photo here of George showing him there. And so they're all connected to Sand Creek. So this is really interesting. We also have a photo of George's brother Robert. There's Robert Bent. And so Robert Bent's connection to Sand Creek, he was actually compelled by Colonel Shivington to guide the soldiers from Fort Lyon to Sand Creek. So he was compelled, and he knew that he had 2 brothers there. He had family living in the village there at Sand Creek. So he wasn't probably overly motivated to take these soldiers and lead them there. So we have a moment in our book, we have a story that we share in our book about Robert Bent. He did something that really isn't ever talked about in history books about Sand Creek. He did something quite remarkable when he led the soldiers. It wasn't in their best interest, I'll put it that way. We have a really neat story about Robert Bent in our book, and really hope you will check that out, because he did something quite remarkable that nobody talks about. So he was compelled, he took the soldiers there, and the similar thing too is, similar to the Bent family, the Bowen family has a connection, obviously, to Sand Creek, but they also needed a fresh start. They actually, my dad's grandpa, and then his dad, my grandpa, they had a ranch in Texas. So we probably weren't supposed to even be in Colorado, but my grandpa's sister, dad's grandpa's daughter, obviously, she was in her home, and there was an explosion in her home. And she came out engulfed in flames, and we go into this in detail in our book too. It's a very sad story. But she came out engulfed in flames, and she didn't make it. She died soon after. And so they also needed a fresh start, so they decided to move from Texas to Colorado and buy a ranch on Sand Creek. So in 1948, Dad's grandparents bought land on Sand Creek, and then the next year, Dad's mom and dad, my grandparents, they bought the adjacent ranch on Sand Creek. And so their 2 adjoining ranches combined for 7 miles of Sand Creek going through both branches. And so this is interesting. So Dad got to grow up on Sand Creek. So he knew that like the back of his hand. It was truly his backyard. He was able to explore, learn every hill and bend, and learn everything about the land. We'll get into that a little bit too. So needing a fresh start, they came to Colorado. And that provided him that opportunity to grow up on Sand Creek. And this is interesting too. In the early 1990s, Mom and Dad were, someone contacted them and let them know that they'd been doing research and that they'd come to the conclusion that that marker at the Sand Creek, what's now where the monument sits at the site there, was considered and called the site, was not correct, that marker marked the wrong spot. And so he was actually an independent archaeologist They got contacted, they got involved, some other groups got involved. They searched, did a helicopter ride over some ranches, including theirs, looking for bins and trails and things that might match what they believed would be the right location for Sand Creek. But after a lot of research in the early to mid 1990s, they came to a conclusion. That brings us to our next excerpt here. There's a lot of evidence the traditional Sand Creek site was mismarked. Most importantly, past searches yielded no period artifacts. The family ranch starts 2 miles up Sand Creek from the monument and includes 7 miles of the creek. It seemed possible the Indian village and the subsequent battle was located on our ranch. In 1995, I said to Sheri, let's find it. We needed to create a plan. We used eyewitness accounts of Sand Creek, artifacts and their location, aerial photo maps, common sense, and lifetime experience. I've spent more time on this part of Sand Creek than anyone. It's given me a unique perspective. When I was a kid, my dad told me that I needed to know the ranch so well that he should be able to drop me off somewhere and I should find my way home. I learned every hill, hollow, creek bank, bend, and trail. Even though it was a 20 square mile cattle ranch, I could see the house no matter where I was, for the most part. It wasn't that big of a challenge, but I learned it nonetheless. Sheri read eyewitness accounts looking for physical land descriptions. The only one we found on the Indian side was from George Bent. We didn't have access to his letters at the time, so Sheri read Life of George Bent, written by George Hyde, compiled from the Bent letters, and published 50 years after Bent died. It included Little Bear's account. Now they later did get access to George Bent's letters, were able to compare, and then find that that book is actually nowhere close to what in George Bent's letters. But we talk about that in great detail in this book. But during this process of discovery, one of the people that went out with Dad on many occasions and found hundreds of artifacts with him was Joe Harburg. He's here. He's going to come up here in just a little bit and talk and share a little bit about a piece that he found. But they found countless things. They found arrowheads, bullets, eagle buttons, sardine cans. They found shell casings, percussion caps. These are just to name a few. They found so many things out there. They also found a tiny arrowhead. It's on display in our case there in the back. So if you didn't get a chance to go through and see those, we encourage you to stop and see those on your way out this evening. Also here this evening is Butch Kelly. He helped Dad identify some of the artifacts he found. And in fact, he identified a piece that could only be from the Sand Creek event. And so we talk about that in the book too. And that actually leads us to another excerpt here. Butch Kelly visited a month later to look at bullets and other artifacts I found. Butch is a local historian and an Indian Wars cavalry reenactor. He portrayed a soldier in Son of the Morning Star, a TV miniseries about George Custer and events prior to the Little Bighorn. He looked at a cavalry carbine swivel from a carbine belt, some spurs, a bit, and 3 or 4 things that could be identified as military, he said. Is there anything else? Butch said after looking at hundreds of artifacts. Wasn't this enough? What more could he want? I had some 5-gallon buckets full of things like barbed wire, fence staples, round nails, and even a hubcap from a Model T Ford. Well, there was the piece of cast iron on the dash of my pickup. It didn't seem worth mentioning. I thought about putting it in my bucket of junk, but I didn't know for sure what it was, so there it stayed. It had sometimes bounced awkwardly, hitting the windshield. I went to get it. There were some threads in it that could have had something like a pipe screwed in it. I handed it to him, thinking it was worthless. Do you know what this is? I had to admit that I didn't. I thought it could be a broken piece of a windmill weight. The old windmills had counterbalance weights instead of tails that are common on them today. Some of the early weights were ornamental and looked like barnyard animals like horses, pigs, or cows. Some were just round balls. Perhaps the threads were where it screwed into the windmill. I'll tell you what this is. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. I was not prepared for what he would say next. I'm going to stop at that point. So the rest of it is in the book. So the rest of that story, I'm just going to pause there and just kind of leave you hanging there for a minute. But you can read all that story in the book. And it was truly an eye-opening piece to find. It only could have been from Sand Creek. So it connected it 100%. And so we learn about that connection, and his connection to Sand Creek, and that familiarity allowed him to find all of these things. So when he read eyewitness accounts, he knew where to hunt. Somebody else could probably read these eyewitness accounts, but they wouldn't know where to go. He knew where to go. So I think that's very important. There's another connection that through research and in the early 2000s, Mom and Dad needed to get their chimney cleaned. And so we're going to talk about Arthur Gibson and Bob Spade. So Dad contacted the man. He found the name in the yellow pages, a man named Bob Spade, 70 miles west. And he told him, I need to get our chimney cleaned. He said, well, that's a long trip. I usually don't go that far. But it turned out he had another appointment in Los Animas. And he said, you can wait. I can do both the same day. So they made it work out. He came to clean their chimney, and he came dressed in this 1860s chimney sweep attire. And so my dad obviously started a conversation with him. He said, I really like your 1860s attire. It reminds me of Sand Creek. Are you familiar with it? And Bob Spade told him, he said, not only am I familiar with it, my great-grandfather fought at Sand Creek. So I think it was a little while later that afternoon before the chimney got cleaned, that I think they spent the afternoon visiting. But they were able to get that connection, and they learned about the connection with Arthur Gibson. And we talk a lot more about these people in our book, too. Arthur Gibson has a really neat account about his experience at Sand Creek that we talk about in our book. So it turned out that this guy that came to clean the chimney was a descendant. And also it turns out, I'll go ahead and we'll go to the next, and there's Bob. He came out to see the Sand Creek site, and he had a gun that belonged to his great-grandfather that he carried with him in Sand Creek. So there's Bob out there, and he got to see where everything took place and where Dad found everything. And then we also have their family tree. Because this is interesting. Okay, so we have Arthur Gibson. You can see him in the left in the center. Arthur Gibson's the one that fought at Sand Creek. His father, Thomas Gibson, was a typesetter and a newspaper man. Actually, one of the founders of the Rocky Mountain News. So that's one of the things we learned through Ancestry Records. So it's very interesting what we can learn when we use this information. And so Thomas was a Rocky Mountain News founder. Had son Arthur was at Sand Creek. And then he had a daughter named Nettie. And it's interesting because Bob Spade, who came out, his mother, Hildred, was unable to care for us. At only 18 months of age, he actually went to go live with his grandparents, and they raised him. And so everything he learned about Sand Creek came from the soldier's daughter, his grandmother. So he learned everything, only separated by one line. So I found that to be very interesting. And so this very interesting what we can learn through Ancestry Records. This is just a snippet of things that we learned. I think Dad mentioned that he has built over 20 family trees through his research. This is just a small sampling of them. So I think that's pretty interesting. And then through that connection and what this leads us to, about our book, just a quick glimpse at our book. This was a team effort. Mom was the researcher, Dad was the archaeologist. And so Mom would read firsthand accounts, they would take notes, and they would look for clues and where to search. But they decided on something very early on, that they would only study eyewitness accounts. They would use period maps and other period documents. They wouldn't use any other book that was not written by an eyewitness. They needed to know what the land looked like. They needed clues to where to search. Our book includes information about Sand Creek that has never been made available to the public before. Really, nobody else has written about Robert Bent and what he did. That's one example. There's a lot of books that have been written about Sand Creek. So what sets this book apart? Well, we learned about a lot of books about Sand Creek. There's a lot of them. Most of them don't cite eyewitnesses, which is interesting. And in fact, they not cite eyewitnesses. They don't cite any information at all. It's just the same information from one book passed to the other. Let's, for example, if I were to write a college paper, or if any of us were to write a college paper and we didn't cite where information came from, do you think we'd get a passing grade? But yet we read these books, and people pass along this information from books that don't cite witnesses at all. So I would call that an academic felony. That's my opinion. And in our book, we actually cite eyewitnesses on both sides. George Bent, who lived as a Cheyenne warrior, wrote letters to historians over 20 years after the event, and he goes into great detail about his experience at Sand Creek. And so our information doesn't come from just a soldier eyewitness, it also comes from the Indian eyewitness as well. And they wrote in great detail, which was very helpful in their research. And through studying eyewitness accounts, one of the things they took note of is, for example, like if somebody made a reference to if they crossed the creek, what side of the creek they were on, any banks that were there, because the creek runs at an angle, actually. It's not just straight, it runs at an angle. So paying attention to those things, if they crossed a creek, what side, banks, and sure enough, there was multiple things that matched with their ranch on Sand Creek. It is amazing what they were able to find. And so the interesting thing too is, and don't forget, as we talked earlier, when his parents and his grandparents, those ranch, was adjacent, and his parents bought that adjacent ranch, making 7 miles of Sand Creek. He had 7 miles of Sand Creek to research and find these places. But again, he had that familiarity with where to go. And the book, it covers several decades, and it covers the whole timeline. Dad has over 7 years experience on this part of Sand Creek. And one of the things about this book is we're interested in truth. We don't have a dog in this fight. We're interested in truth. And so that's what's important to us. And a lot of the information over the years, what they found has been suppressed. So we just want people to read the book and make up their own mind. That's important to us. Because this book is not about changing history. This book is about correcting a part of history. Because a lot of this information gets been suppressed and been minimized. And it's the only book on Sand Creek based on eyewitness evidence and the location of artifacts. So the location of artifacts is really the most important thing. And this book is different than a lot of history books. It's written more in memoir style. And we share anecdotes about Dad's life, and we use dialogue to push the story forward. There's so many people involved in this book, we thought it was best to preserve those stories through the use of dialogue. And so it's written a little differently than most history books, but it's really a true raw book about discovery. Another thing about this book took a lot of guts to write. It really did, because there's information in here that people don't want out in the public, because it's been suppressed, and you can read more about it in the book. And over the years, they were provided promises of credit for finding it. And those promises were not fulfilled. You can read about who made those promises, and read all about that. And so we learn about, this connection. Studying eyewitness accounts such as Irving Halbert, for example, that's what led to learning about the connection with genealogy. Irving Halbert was one of the first that kind of led us down that road because of his connection. Connected to Shibington and his father being a minister. We found that all very interesting. And genealogy and ancestry records can be helpful in learning what's true about somebody. Kind of like Elbridge Gerry. That was helpful for us in that. One thing that's of note when we look at what Dad found, there's a marker at the historic site, but below that bluff, no artifacts have yet been found. So that's again information that people don't want out there. But beginning about 2 miles up the creek, over 4,000 artifacts have been found. And in fact, they actually stopped counting in the early 2000s. So I don't know what that number is actually today. It's much larger than that. But the thing about the artifacts is without artifacts, everything else is just a theory. The artifacts, that's the concrete thing. That's the concrete evidence. And so all of that kind of ties into, using genealogy, all of that ties into their story and their research, and was helpful in learning what's true. So at this time, it might take him a minute to get up here, but we're going to invite Joe to come up here in just a second. He's going to come share with us. He found something pretty amazing. He was helping Dad one day.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joe Harvard. I know some of you. Jeff, God love you. I'm glad I'm not on the bus no more. And according to my grandbabies, the only true Santa Claus is right over there. Okay, my stories are short. I was riding with Chuck one day. We were going out to look for stuff, and on the dash of his pickup was this big, heavy thing. I picked it up. Chuck, what on earth is this? And this is it right here. And I couldn't figure out what it was. I know it was very heavy. And he said, that's part of an actual cannonball. And he proceeded to explain to me how it worked. It had a fuse in it, and inside it, it had anywhere from 40 to 100 little, I call them little steelies, but it depends on how they produced them, how they made them, how thick they were, how many would actually go into the cannonball. And it was just amazing. I mean, it's just a hunk of metal, but everything, at least I'm sure when we find stuff out there, man, everything has a story. And I'm just always so, man, what's the real story of this? Did this hit somebody? Did this kill somebody? And so we're out there, we park, and about 100 yards, 80 yards, 100 yards, Chuck had driven a green fence post into the ground, and he said, that marks this spot. And oh my gosh. So anyway, we're the metal detecting, and usually when we do this, we try to go in rows, and we put like a little flag down, and we go up, and then we come back and put another flag or move the other, so we just don't go everywhere. My metal detector went off. I dug down yay far, and for once I knew what I had found. I was so happy because I actually knew what it was. And I found this little pup, and oh, it looks just like the one on the dash. I was so happy because I knew what it was. I called Chuck over. He always takes a picture and GPS's stuff. And if you really want to get into this, you should bring out the boards that you have that he takes a picture and GPS. I just, you know, I'm not a smart guy. I certainly wasn't out there when all this was going on. But I don't see how anyone could possibly disagree with what happened right there on that land. I personally found bullets, metal arrowheads. This stuff it's one day I dug down. It was deeper, and it was a spur. The thing that goes on the back of is that what it's called? I don't even know what they're called. But I thought, oh my gosh, what's the story on this thing? And man, if I'm riding a horse, I think I need that thing. But anyway, so anyway, we're coming back, and I said, Chuck, do you have that piece I found? I'd like to look at it. And he has like a nail belt. If you're doing shingles, and you place with a hammer, place with the nails, and so he got in there, got it, and gave it to me. And I'm fooling around looking at it, and I grabbed the one on the dash. Now remember, I said it was 100 yards, and oh my gosh, guess what? It fit together, and that's part of the cannonball right there. And I thought, what's the odds of that? And that just intrigued me to no end. And I'll share one more thing. Because Chuck, everything we dig up, that man knows what it is. And this is short. We're metal detecting. We don't find much on this thing. There's a cow trail, and it's like yay big. And we meet, and we're not 3 feet apart. You put your metal detector down on the cow trail, just resting, and the thing goes off. And I dig it up, and it's a metal star, and that metal star, Sheri, would fit on a quarter. And Chuck, what on earth is this? And he said, star tobacco. What? What are you talking about? Well, anyway, instead of buying Red Man or Skull or whatever, you have it in the little round thing and put it in your back pocket, and you're cool if you have a circle in your jeans after a while. This was star tobacco, and he proceeded to tell me that it came in like a little cake, and the symbol and the name of it was star tobacco, and that's every time they sold one, that's what it was, and someone just flipped that star right out there, and you know, we found many other things, but I won't waste your time. But anyway, I thought this was very interesting. The star tobacco, and he ceases to amaze me with everything that we dig up. He always knows what it is. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you for sharing that, Joe. I always enjoy hearing these stories because, you know, Joe's gone out so many times. And, you know, a lot of these stories date back, you know, this discovery took place over many years. And I'm 42 now, but I was in school, I was still in high school when a lot of this was happening. I wasn't even around, I was at school, I was at home, and Joe and Dad would go out and they would find things like this. And I find those stories very fascinating. Thank you for sharing. I just think it's awesome what you guys have found. And then, you know, thank you to Butch. He helped identify some really amazing pieces. Both of these guys are so instrumental in this book coming together and this discovery. And so it's really, you know, been several people that have been involved over the years. You can read about it in the book. And so we hope that you know, if you haven't picked up a copy, pick up a copy. We'll gladly sign it for you if you'd like. We invite you to stay and look at a sampling of our artifacts. And again, thank you to the Prowers County Genealogical Society for hosting us tonight. If you're here and you're not a member, maybe consider becoming a member. So we're very thankful for them having us. This has truly been an honor to be here to present it. And we invite you to stay, come see a sampling of these artifacts, and visit with us a little bit. We can answer some questions for you.